ahead and get started with the next panel. I'm Purcell. I'm one of the graduate co-coordinators and organizers for this event. And I'm also a PhD student here in history at Columbia, and I am the moderator of this panel, switching hats. And I'm really excited for the pop history panel because it seems to me that there are two themes that have sort of been coming up again and again over the course of the previous panels. And they're broad, but one is sort of, history in action is history in new social spaces, and that history in action is also a lot about sort of outreach and engagement and audience. And there seems to be some implication that, both of those facts have an impact on how we do history, or could be doing history, or should be doing history, and what history looks like. And I think that pop history is actually one of the ways of sort of getting at those questions most directly. Here, setting the panelists up for things that they're not actually going to talk about, but that's one set of possible questions here. I can't begin to express how excited I am to welcome these three people to this panel and to introduce them and to give them the floor. I know it's a little embarrassing to start a panel that way, but I'm genuinely so enthusiastic about this group of people. First in the middle here is Reyhan Harmanci, who is an executive editor at Atlas Obscura, which is a media company focusing on the weird and wonderful places in the world. Her resume reads like what's what of all of the coolest new media outlets. She worked at HAPA company before she was at Atlas Obscura. She's been at BuzzFeed. She was at my second favorite publication after Atlas Obscura, which was Modern Farmer, and also the San Francisco Chronicle. She also taught a course last year at the Columbia Journalism School, sort of dipping her toe into academia on reinventing the magazine. To her left is Brianna Nofil, who is a doctoral student in U.S. history here at Columbia. She's studying policing and detention law in the 20th century. Before she came here, she was a Baer Fellow in Business Law and Human Rights at the Kenan Institute for Ethics, where she worked on business ethics and human rights and the UN commissions on grievance processes. And when she's not doing either of those things, she writes about immigration, prisons, and stolen monasteries for Atlas Obscura. And finally, here to my left is Rebecca Onion, who is a history writer at Slate, and where she also runs the documents blog, The Vault. She's written about history for many, many, many publications, which includes Atlas Obscura, apparently, which I did not know before this, so I think you should be paying us, Reyhan. Rebecca has her PhD in American Studies from the University of Texas at Austin, and her first book, Innocent Experiments, Childhood and Culture of Public Science in the U.S., is coming out this year from UNC Press. Congratulations. Rebecca is also working on this project, and has been for the last year, to figure out if there is a history beat, much like there's a science beat or crime beat, and sort of what the different components of that might look like, and this sort of tough question, is it actually viable to be a history journalist in the world and history writer? And with that, I will let Reyhan take it away.
Great. So happy to be here. Here at Columbia didn't ask me that to teach journalism, but we'll take that up later. Well, I guess to begin, I just wanted to tell you guys a little bit about Atlas Obscura. Over the past year, I've given this kind of spiel to prospective employees and just to writers and friends who are like, where is it that you work? But a lot of times I cut out the real origin story. Atlas Obscura is a media company that has a few different platforms. We have a user-generated database of incredible places. There's over 10,000 published now that are contributed by people who go places or know places that are kind of off the beaten path or often invisible. Like a lot of times it's like a building you would be like, that doesn't look like anything. The history is actually fascinating. So we have the Atlas database. We have our editorial operation where everybody here is contributing to, and I hope everyone in this room maybe can contribute to. That is conventional sort of paid editorial. We commission stories, we commission photo essays, illustrations, anything we think fulfills our editorial mission of being a guide to the world's hidden wonders. And then we have our events platform. So in doing this spiel, I talk about how the two co-founders, Josh and Dylan Durst, wanted to be explorers and wanted to have access to amazing places. But the real way they met was Josh was running a blog called, I think it was the Athenaeus Kircher Appreciation Society. And if you're familiar with him, he sounds like an amazing man. He was a 17th century German Jesuit scholar. He, I'm just reading off the list now, published over 40 major works. He wrote an encyclopedia of China. He claimed to have deciphered the hieroglyphics. He invented a ton of things, including the first megaphone and the magnetic clock. And he was really into microscopes, and he correctly linked the plague to an infectious microorganism, which was a really kind of brilliant deduction on his part. So Josh was running this blog all about this extremely obscure guy and put out a call for collaborators. And exactly one person replied, and it was Dylan. And together they decided to form a partnership and kind of create a website that was dedicated to the obscure, the amazing, the hidden, and also the weird and strange and kind of like unsettling. History obviously is not full of like happy stories. So at Atlas Obscura, we are really interested in kind of telling underappreciated or stories that have that kind of hidden element to it. And it is, from the beginning when I was approached about the job, I saw an opportunity because in general, I don't think digital media has been great about appreciating history. They're much more interested in the future. Places like BuzzFeed and Fast Company, it just seemed like everyone was chasing the same stories. And often those stories lacked any kind of context. You had this effect of like, it was if like things that happened earlier in the day were the first time in recorded history anyone had done that, which is clearly not true. You could see that there was a kind of underutilized asset. And I think this is maybe a little bit of, it's like perception bias or something, where like, ever since I've started Atlas, though, I've been seeing stories that involve strong historical elements in a lot of other places. I think a lot of popular media is waking up to the storytelling impact of history. It seems relevant to this panel to sort of like acknowledge like that's a good thing and also a bad thing, or there can be times when that sort of desire to showcase that like amazing photograph, but then you have it on Twitter with like a caption that is completely wrong, So like, as popular media kind of wants to have more context, wants to bring in all the assets that history can give us, which is, incredible narratives, like incredible visuals, and kind of this like untapped wealth from like looking behind as well as forward. There's obviously like better and worse practices around it. But I think we will see more places like even like a Gawker start to do stories that are basically historical nuggets that have that kind of like unexpected quality because readers want it, and also in the age of social media, I think a lot of companies are really interested in stories that have an emotional impact. One of the biggest levers you can pull is nostalgia. That's like why you see a lot of stories about the 1990s, I think. But I think people are going to find ways to like dig even deeper on that. So I think I feel really hopeful about pop history and really excited about where it's going. Also cautious that there have to be ways to give it some quality control. And I think historians need more outlets to kind of tell their stories in like a more nuanced, like kind of factually correct way. And I want you guys to pitch me more stories.
Thanks so much, Reyhan. I think you raised a lot of interesting issues and sort of potentially challenging questions about sort of the use of our work and the way our work is read and our obligations there. And I hope we get to talk about this a little more later. Now I'll turn it over to Brianna, and I didn't mention this, but Brianna and I co-wrote a pop history piece together that we worked on for. You got it? Okay, thank you. Take it away. Oh yes.
Okay, thank you so much, Jake. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a long-form history writing project called Medieval America that my colleague Jake and I wrote this past year for Atlas Obscura, thanks in part to a HAPA grant. So I'm going to talk about why we thought this was a story that we could tell to a popular audience, and also how it changed how I think about writing history and the feasibility of doing this type of work while in graduate school. So this project began somewhat inorganically, I would say. Jake is a medieval legal historian. I'm a 20th century US legal historian. We kind of jokingly talked about trying to create some project that involved medieval things in America and somebody breaking laws, ideally. And honestly, not a lot springs to mind. But what we did think of was the cloisters, which is right in town. And we knew that the cloisters had been brought to the U.S. By John Rockefeller in 1925, and we knew that they were comprised of a bunch of different medieval buildings. But we didn't know much more beyond that. But from there, we began thinking, well, if Rockefeller thought to do this, maybe other American businessmen had the same idea. So were there any other medieval buildings that had been transplanted from Europe to the United States? So we began snooping around and we started finding these transplanted medieval buildings all over the place, about 20 in total. There was one in my hometown of Miami. Jake's family knew of one in Northern California. And these buildings were in parks and on university campuses and museums. And some of them were in great shape and some of them were still in pieces. And I think one thing that we found really interesting was that though almost all of these sites had a local history, they had an individual story about how they got there and their acquisition, we couldn't find anything that looked at the importation of medieval buildings in the late 1920s and the early 1930s as a trend or a pattern. So there was nothing that considered that all of these buildings were being dismantled, packed stone by stone into thousands of crates, shipped across the ocean, and then reconstructed in the United States at roughly the same historical moment. So this seemed like one of those potential big picture gaps that people with historical training could fill. So from there, I think our big question went from how many of these buildings are there to why on earth would anyone consider this a reasonable thing to do? And the more we dug into this story, just the weirder and weirder it got. So I'm going to tell you just a really quick overview of one of the buildings that we talk about, and that's St. Bernard de Clairvaux, which is depicted here in pieces. So this is it when it arrives in Miami, Florida in 1953, I believe. But it took a lot of work to get it to this point. So can you put the next one? Okay, so probably the most notorious importer of medieval buildings is this gentleman, William Randolph Hearst. He's notorious for some other things too. So he, so he's the guy who's responsible for importing St. Bernard de Clairvaux. But the guy who's responsible for finding this monastery is this guy, his very crafty art dealer, Arthur Vine. So Arthur Vine found this monastery in the middle of Spain, and he said, look, I'm going to be able to sell this to Hearst because Hearst will buy literally anything. Hearst ended up buying 3 monasteries from this guy. But in order to get this monastery out of Spain, it took some legwork. This was not legal. So Arthur Vine goes to the Spanish government and he says, you guys are in a tough economic position right now. This is a jobs creation program. I'm going to hire people to help me take down this monastery. The Spanish government's coming half of an issue right now. So they're okay, yeah, that's fine. So everyone just kind of looks the other way while this guy pays them off. So he ends up hiring over 100 men. He fights off at least 2 documented cases of rioting townspeople. And he also even has to create a makeshift railroad just to get these stones from the middle of Spain to a port. Okay, get some on the ships. 11 ships sail for America carrying these stones. They're not out of the woods yet. When they get to America, hoof and mouth disease is breaking out in Europe. So American public health officials are really, really concerned that the hay that's being used to package these stones might contain disease. So they burn all of the hay. While they're burning all of the hay, they end up burning all the directions for putting the monastery back together. So that means that William Randolph Hearst is now in possession of what Time magazine called at the time the world's largest jigsaw puzzle. Making matters worse, the Great Depression hit. So Hearst has no money anymore, and so he definitely can't afford to put this thing back together. The stones end up in a warehouse in the Bronx for 30 years before some entrepreneurs decide to reconstruct the whole thing in Miami, basically as like a tourist trap. So today, does that work? Okay, yeah, so this is what it looked like in the 1950s. You can see the crates coming.
Can you grab the lights?
I mean, this is enough visual impact. It's a lot of crates. There's a lot of boxes. I should know in directions. Okay. So today, if you click to the next one, this is what it looks like today. Today the site is a tourist attraction. It has a congregation, and it's been used for everything from Victoria's Secret catalog shoots to Rick Ross music videos. So I think our initial reason for wanting to write this story as for a public audience was that it was really one of these like truth is stranger than fiction stories that on a purely pragmatic level seemed like we could find someone to publish it. The story has a lot of really poppy elements and characters. It's got crazy billionaires and international crime and mouth disease. And I think we were intrigued because the stories of these buildings were so steeped in mythology. So we would keep finding these one-off notes in museum descriptions or in newspaper articles about these crazy things that people thought happened. Like, for example, there was one story that Francisco Franco demanded they return this monastery once he came to power. He was like, wasn't there a monastery there? So I think part of our motivation was to figure out how these histories have been constructed by the people who operated these sites and how much of this we could substantiate through primary sources. A second reason I think it made sense for us to write this story for a popular audience was that we saw this topic engaging with a lot of contemporary issues about cultural heritage and legal rights to ownership and the stakes of preservation. So we were writing this story at the same time that a lot of the destruction of Syrian cultural heritage sites was happening. And people were raising all of these questions about what obligations the international community had to protect these sites. And how we weighed these obligations against the nation-state's claim to ownership. And this not only parallels a lot of the discussions that were happening in the 1920s and the 1930s, but in some cases, like the cultural heritage laws that Europe still has on the books came as a direct result of like the antics of Hearst and his cohort. I think it also raised the question of like what it even means to steal something. So in many cases, the ways that Americans were getting these buildings out of European countries were technically legal, often because they were privately owned or the existing law just didn't cover them for some reasons. But other times they were getting out just because someone paid off the dock workers. What I think we found really striking was that a lot of the American business people who were buying these sites in the 20s and 30s talked to the media about how they were rescuing these sites from war-torn Europe. They said these buildings have been just sitting and just been ruined for generations, and so America has an almost obligation to protect them. But then, at the same time as we have that very lofty rhetoric, like we found a letter from Hearst to his mother where he calls Spain a tired, worn-out monarchy prime for exploitation. And then he goes on to say, "We will burst through the Pyrenees into Spain and ravage the country." How does that strike you? So I think the story draws out these tensions, and I think that because of the much faster publishing timeframe of digital popular history, we were kind of able to tell this story at a relevant moment. And then the last reason I think this worked as a popular history was because these were public places that existed in communities and that a lot of people already had a stake in. So one of the other Spanish monasteries that Hearst bought and then ran out of money to rebuild ended up in pieces in Golden Gate Park. Like the stones were just sitting in Golden Gate Park for about 30 years. So as you might expect, like people have a lot of memories of these rocks being there, and people were invested in their story and knowing what happened to them. And my instinct with popular history is that your job is easier if people either recognize the characters or the setting right off the bat, or if you can establish what's important or compelling about your story really quickly. And I think this particular story gave us a little bit of both. In thinking about how writing this is different from writing academic history, I think that for me the biggest difference was how central characters were. I think that in academic history, we're often trained to avoid going too in-depth on an individual's biography because it kind of risks equating like character and causation. But in a story like the one we wrote for Obscura about businessmen making this really bizarre series of decisions, I think biography and even some stab at psychology becomes pretty critical. So the question that we tried to keep at the forefront of our minds while writing was like, what big questions would the audience have in hearing this story for the first time? And I think the biggest question that we thought the audience would have is like, what would motivate these guys to undertake this? And that's a good question because it allows us to like answer it on several levels. So on the most surface level, like Hearst wanted to build a 60-room medieval castle in the California woods. And so he was going to take this monastery and turn it into a little like cabana for a swimming pool, and he was going to put a diving board at the altar. That was the actual plan. That was really great. But on a deeper level, there's an interest in the medieval world during this part of the 20th century that extends way beyond Hearst, and I think we argue reveals things about Americans' relationship to capitalism and their relationship to their own history. So I think the key for us was kind of starting with characters and building outward. So to say, like, yes, Hearst had certain characteristics and interests that compelled him to do this, but he also had to build these networks of dealers and government officials and work within the constraints of the time period to get these buildings out. So individual motivations are only part of the story, and once we dig a little deeper, there are these far broader historical stakes that we can embed in a kind of very poppy narrative. So in reflecting on this project, I think we got a lot out of it. I don't know when I'll ever get to work with a medieval historian again. It definitely made me think differently about how I write and how to communicate more effectively and creatively. But I think one of the things we were both struck by was how similar the research process was to writing academically. To get through this project, we went to the local archives, we did interviews at the site in Miami and a site in Northern California, and we went through newspapers and all your standard digital repositories. And in the end, I think the amount of research felt really comparable to what we would have done to turn this into an academic article. And I think that this is one of maybe the difficult things about thinking about doing this kind of work as a graduate student. It is really, really time-consuming to produce rigorous popular history. And though there's definitely benefits to it, like interaction with the public and with editors is all really great, I think it's probably fair to say that this work is never going to be, or at least right now, is probably not going to be considered particularly legitimate by like an academic job committee. So I think that raises the question of like, should we be encouraging graduate students to do this work? Or like, should Jake and I have written this as an academic article and then tried to turn it into a pop history later? And so are these more intangible benefits of writing popular history at this particular phase in our career enough to outweigh some of the costs?
Thank you so much for that, Brianna. Up next is Rebecca and we'll get her set up over here.
And since I made that start in 2012, I've also started writing longer things for Slate, and when I started, I mostly blogged. But the 3 years and change that I've spent doing the vault make for what I think is a good, interesting little sample size to use when talking about the topic of what goes viral that's historical and why does it go viral when it does. So just to explain a little bit about how I pick a vault post. When I pick up a post, a document for a post, I look for the kinds of documents that have multiple layers of sort of story, context, and interest attached to them. I think of them as like rich documents. Often, though not always, they're formally appealing or beautiful or strange looking. They lend themselves to representation digitally. They're kind of fun to look at. They should be short enough or small enough to be absorbed in full by a reader who's kind of distracted by a million other things, including Alice Obscura on the internet. If they come from a longer document, like a list extracted from a government report or like a table of contents from a book, I like the longer document to be available on the web so that people can follow the general principle of trying whenever possible to give the person who's reading access to the full thing so that if they're interested, they can look into it. And then I write a 300-word post about it. I give it context, and I try to include as many hyperlinks as I can to more reading on the sort of the topics that are brought up by this document. So then I promote the document on Facebook and Twitter through the @SlateVault Twitter account and the Slate Vault Facebook. A little plug. And then the Slate account, the larger, parent Slate account promotes it in the same places. So there, what is really important is that the document has to circulate based on just a headline, a single image, and on Facebook, a little bit of introductory text, a little bit of that first paragraph. So as with the circulation of history, I think in any other popular medium, the structure of the type of communication will inevitably affect the way that the web talks about history. So I would say that the push for virality, although I try not to think about it too much, has definitely subtly shaped my approach. I've been keeping track of the posts that did the best traffic-wise. So on my personal website, I have a list of everything that got over 1K Facebook shares, which I think of as sort of what did the best. And then I also keep track of the ones that I had high hopes for that didn't do so well. So this is another list. Favorites on my website, www.rebeccaonion.com. And so these are sort of like, I've been keeping them for my own information, but I'm also going to use them in this talk as my samples. So something I think about a lot is a study I read once. In 2012, the marketing professors Jonah Berger and Catherine Milkman published a paper about 3 months of New York Times articles that had made it to the most emailed list. And in that paper, they argued that emotion is what drives virality. Because of the social nature of transmission on the web, they said evocative content, which is what they call activating or arousing, is more likely to provoke transmission, to make you share something. And the balance of the emotion isn't as much of an issue. The content could be positive, awe-inspiring, or negative, anger or outrage-inspiring. The important thing is sort of the strength of the emotion that pushes somebody to share. I'm expressing this idea really bluntly, I think. In his book, Berger writes, talking about remarkable things provides social currency. So when it comes to what's remarkable in history, currency comes when you share something new about a public figure or a situation that's already well known. So remarkability is related to sort of recognizability, my theory. So that's the reason why I think super successful charlatan historical Twitter accounts like History and Pics share an endless round of new Marilyn Monroe, Audrey Hepburn, and Kennedy photos. So this is the infamous History and Pics, which you can check out if you have a second. So they take a personality or happening that requires basically no explanation, and then they add a simple grace note on top. So you say, like if they share this picture of JFK, so you've seen JFK, you know what JFK is, right? But have you seen him standing next to his daughter Caroline wearing a JFK mask? So these pictures are rarely sourced well, or maybe even sourced at all. I think they're sourced from Reddit, basically. But what's important and disturbing to me is the narrowness of topics evident in their coverage. So this is something that I think we talk a lot within the academy when we're talking about historical virality or popularity of history. We talk a lot about accuracy, and I actually think that's like less interesting to me than the kind of coverage that makes it to popular venues. So yeah, so this is sort of a good indication of the type parameters that history on the internet has to traverse. In order to be remarkable, it's better if a bit of history being shared links to something that's already common knowledge. That makes the sharer feel like they're in the know. So because of this principle, I think, on the vault, things that are about World War II, the Civil War, people like Laura Ingalls Wilder, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Kurt Vonnegut is huge, Emily Dickinson, Lincoln, Lovecraft, the civil rights movements of the early 60s only, especially the uncontroversial nonviolent aspect. Those are all predictably shareable. So here are some examples of posts that I did that are related to that did well. Oh yeah, that's a Lovecraft Notes for Mountains and Madness. Yeah, okay. So, on the other hand, there's documents that I really like for example, here are some, these are German caricatures of Napoleon's army retreating from Russia, which is a set of images that's sort of biting in its specificity, and to me it was super sort of met the requirements of my format. It was just sort of visually compelling. Each of these soldiers, there's I ran 8 or 9 of these sort of little pantheons of tattered soldiers, and each of them is tattered in a different way. It's very specific and raw, but it doesn't relate to a situation whose parameters Americans really remember. So, whose side were the Germans on again? Why were they mad about this? Or what was the deal? So despite what I thought was sort of an exceptionally interesting combination of satirical caricature mode, visually compelling encyclopedic catalog of the bodies of beleaguered men, the document loses some power in transmission because Americans no longer remember the stakes of the encounter. Indeed, the vault is quite American. And part of this is because I am an American Studies PhD, and those are the archives that I find familiar. But part of it is because documents and objects that come from other countries, especially those that are in other languages, don't strike the same chord. Documents that raise confusing questions about cause, effect, or blame also fare poorly. Or I should say they're more delicate to present and sometimes fare poorly. So Annalee Newitz, who I believe no longer edits IO9, but used to edit IO9, the popular science fiction and science site, in 2013 wrote a post calling this the problem of the Valley of Ambiguity. So Newitz, who actually has an English and American Studies PhD, diagrammed her theory of virality in this post that really struck a chord with me as well. So you won't be able to read that probably, but here's her theory, the Valley of Ambiguity. Her insight was that, from her own experience putting stuff up on IO9 and other places, that links that claim to tell an absolute truth can go just as viral as memes because the two share a total lack of ambiguity. And Newitz points out that items that seem virtuous, based on a desire for epistemological certainty, a commonly accepted morality, like the now ubiquitous news explainers, everything you need to know about, the Jonah storm or whatever it is, or TED Talks. She says those become viral for the same reason that grumpy cat pictures do. Why do I want to share these stories, Newitz asks? Because in some sense they are not open to interpretation. You don't have to worry whether your friends will wonder why you shared this. It is completely obvious. Working in science journalism, Newitz has different lost stories than I do. Perhaps her most analogous examples are reports on important scientific findings with difficult to interpret results. She writes, there is no satisfaction in knowing that the Higgs boson has been sort of found, but sort of not. Because of the way that the sharing internet is shaped, the historical documents that do well seem to need to participate in that kind of truth-telling. Since things whose moral can be told in a headline go the farthest. So this selects for historical episodes whose meaning has been basically resolved in present times. So some examples from the vault are this letter that Helen Keller wrote in the 30s to German students who were planning to burn her book. This really sexist personality quiz from 1959 about whether or not, because we all know the 50s were sexist, right? Okay. And the lynching map of the United States, it's Tuskegee Institute document. Yeah, okay, so, these are all good things, but at the same time, I know why they were popular, because it was very obvious what they meant. So, for example, the internet's affection for a good map, which is a traffic magnet, so relied upon as to become kind of a joke among media producers, everything you need to know about X in a single map. I think it's related to this viral bias for truth-telling. Anytime you can say that a complicated historical concept is visible in a single map or a single chart, you're on the right track to transmission. So this is an example that made me nervous. The problem with historical maps and charts, which I often use on the wall, things that were produced, from the point of view of certainty of someone who was, making the map in 1910 or 1950, whatever. Like any map, historical or contemporary, they can be unreliable. So my interest in the maps as a historian is in their backstory and their fallibility, and any academic historian would probably feel the same way. So if I find myself in the position of writing about a map like this 1903 map of American immigration, which is like visually crazy, like we kind of tried to stuff so much data into this map, but it's also sort of really interesting that they were trying to do this in 1903, right? So what I'm hoping that readers catch the part in the text where I point out that the language, there's embedded in it is a eugenics-derived racial characterization, and that's something that that the map was using to sort out where recent immigrants were, obviously a great concern in 1903. And I'm not taking the map's data as a given, but the problem with that is that in order to make a map probably you can't say in the headline everything I just said. Hey, it's a map from 1903 that may or may not be accurate. And isn't it interesting that they thought about it this way and also eugenics? So, you hope that people are reading the text, basically, which, as Reyhan probably knows, is not always a given as well. Okay, so, a good example of this that I'm sort of like a little, not ashamed of, but wish that I'd done differently, is this map, the Histo map, which is from the 30s, and it's like internet compelling because it's really long, and you just keep scrolling and scrolling. And it's one of these like 1930s, the guy's project, a guy named John Sparks, was to represent all of history, and he had a very like 30s attitude about what history was. And usually I write my own headlines for my posts, but in this case I had an editor who wrote this head, and it was written like this. And the problem is that the chart doesn't actually have anything about Central or South America or Native America. So I very rightly got a lot of emails being like, if not all of the world history. And I'm like, I know. So my editor wrote that. Like, but I did, But the thing is that the head is misleading, but it is very internet friendly. I think this actually this went up 2 years ago, but it recently resurfaced, and now it has something like 150,000 Facebook shares. Okay, so here are some favorite examples of documents with high ambiguity quotients that didn't quite make it. So this is one of my favorite fall documents like ever. This is an intimidation letter that was sent to a black candidate for office in the South of Georgia in 1868, sort of the first wave of the KKK. And it's like, it looks like this. This is from the Gilder Lehrman Center. And it's written from the point of view of a ghost who's, it's sort of voiced in this way of like, I'm hiding in the woods, I'm watching you and all of the people like you, and I'm gonna come get you along with everyone else who died. And so it's this really weirdly dramatic narrative. The writing is like he's sort of illiterate, like it's like written in this like really stream of consciousness style. And it just didn't work. Like people didn't, of course it's also a telling document. It shows us what it might have been like in Georgia during Reconstruction, but it just didn't go. Like I don't know why people didn't want to be seen as like sharing a threat letter from the KKK. It doesn't look great on your like Facebook feed. But it's another good example of like the point of sharing it is to say, look at this cool thing. But because of the way that sharing works, it associates you with it in a way that people might have found unsavory. A similar thing happened with this post about these maps that the Japanese army put up in the carriers that were taking soldiers back to Japan after the end of World War II. And they're like these maps that show where the bombings happened. So that's Hiroshima. And I thought, this is like visually fascinating, a really interesting backstory. It's sad and awful, but I think it barely went anywhere. And I think that's partly because readers didn't like the idea of, like, you don't know when you're sharing it, like, are you saying America was wrong to do this bombing, or are we just talking about what happened, or what is the stance that you're taking when you share it? So one last thing I want to talk about a little bit that I think this audience might find interesting. An epiphany I've had while curating the blog is that there are some historical documents that I'm a little loath to reshare. I don't really want to put them on the internet, and actually the threat letter sort of edges towards this. So I'm afraid of sometimes of reproducing a kind of racism or misogyny that might kind of break free of the context that I can give it and take on a new life. So an example of one time when this almost happened is that I did a post in October 2013 that also didn't do too well, though I really liked the idea. I looked at 1910 editions of a column called Think and Grin, which was a humor column in Boys Life, the Boy Scouts of America's magazine. So probably won't surprise many historians to hear that there are a lot of racist jokes in there. Dumb Chinamen, Irish people, sort of minstrelsy influenced caricatures of black people. So yeah, here's a couple of examples. The top one is a sort of an Irish joke, the bottom one is a minstrelsy joke. And so my editor believed that reproducing especially the minstrelsy jokes would be a bridge too far. So we linked to them instead. The compromise was, instead of reproducing a little bit of text from the column in my own text, writing about it, I said, and there were also some of these kinds, and I linked to the Google Books example. I actually received an angry reader email about that. At least one reader believed that our decision not to include those jokes was a failure of the liberal media, which I couldn't really parse as an argument, but I think it had to do with us refusing to represent the truth as it really was. I'm still not sure what I think about that case, but I do know that I have shied away from items like a crazy misogynist book from Britain. Oh yeah, I didn't include that one, sorry. Alas. I'll just talk about it. Okay, so the misogynist book from Britain was called What Men Hate About Women, and it had this table of contents of like all the different ways that women were horrible. And it sort of, it went around Twitter as like can you believe how crazy this historical item is? And I thought, oh, maybe I'll put that on the ball. And then I saw some people using it as like a woman, kind of like this is how they are, kind of thing. I don't know if I want this to be out there. And for the same reason, I decided not to reproduce a racist take on Batman that was published in 1965 by the American Nazi Party called Here Comes White Man. And so in many respects, that particular item fit the criteria of the vault document. It takes something that's really well known, Batman, and twists it to the side. But I just couldn't see how I could be the one to give it new life. I couldn't imagine putting out a tweet with it, like one of these sort of like ugly caricatures attached to it and just putting it out there. And I don't know, it has something to do with the way the format is. I may figure out ways to do this more effectively, but I'd love to hear what you think about all of this.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Rebecca, and to Reyhan and Brianna as well. I think those were really interesting presentations that raised a lot of issues. Reyhan, I sort of appreciate your optimism about the economics of the situation. The idea that context actually does matter is something thrilling, though maybe a little bit in tension with what Rebecca is suggesting. The desire for the familiar, which is something we can figure out how to reconcile. Brianna, I think your points about payoff are really useful, and I think that sort of, you're going to hate me for this, but in sort of your case study of doing popular history as you're presenting, like you raised interesting questions of like tone, presentation through that demonstration, and that was really helpful. And I also like your point about sort of maybe there are many instances in which these barriers between academic history and pop history are not actually quite so obvious or real. And Rebecca, your sort of post or your talk about viralness, was really, really interesting, and it kind of hurts as a historian to think about because we want complexity. Like, I don't know, I feel like that's sort of the heart of what I do as a historian, and yeah, right, so reconciling this, and the fact that it is the format, and so I didn't realize this when we put this panel together, but apparently pop history now means history on the web, which, so here's the proof. Right, so those are some of the things I was thinking about. We have, I think, 30 minutes for questions. Yeah, so if anyone would like to get us started.
Just one thing, I write pop history, but I've just finished the first book, but then articles, and I just wanted to say firstly that Jake and Brianna, I think that your project would be a fantastic book. I really think that it's something that you should explore. Right? This is my personal take. But I have a question for Rebecca, and I'm curious. I've written occasionally for Slate, and sometimes it's gone viral. But I've done history through science. I got access to the Laura, and I'm curious. I co-wrote a piece where we then got contacted by documentary makers that were already starting in on the film, and are we going to participate? And they wanted to then bring it to NPR as well, And I was just curious. You've done so many interesting stories. Do you let it all roll off your back if somebody starts doing a bigger project around your research? Has that happened to you as well?
Yeah. I have too much to do. I don't know. I mean, sometimes I think, I do sometimes hold things back if I think I'm going to do something bigger about it. Like if there's a bigger thing that I want to do, that there's an obvious wall post attached to it, I'm like, I don't know. I think I'm going to, someone will get this if I put it out there, but that's pretty rare.
Have you had people start documentaries, or NPR picks it up as like a radio documentary? What have they done?
I think things have gotten picked up by NPR. I don't know about how full scale.
And because I'm just curious, is there once it's out on the internet, do you feel like there is any legal hold on it for you, or that it's just gone?
So I mean, part of the sort of editorial stance of the vault is to be like, check out all these awesome digital archives that are out there. Like that's part of our, at least my purpose, is to introduce people to the many digital archives that are maintained by universities and institutions that people don't know about. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, I guess there could be, there's no legal argument. I don't think
I think it comes down to the writer's contract. And I think that'll determine the intellectual property rights and whether they're held by the writer or the publisher or some combination of the two. So in due course, I think it's spring from that understanding first.
But I'm actually talking about beyond the publisher, where someone sees the material and the research that you've done and says, this is out there in the public, and I'm going to make. And I find that it's a difficult decision because, who wants to get caught up in a legal battle, But you might have worked on something for 6 months, and then, all your sources and somebody's now saying, oh, thank you for that, and I'm going to bring that into larger case. So, because I see so many things on Obscura, for example, that are so fascinating. I'm thinking, oh wow, I wonder if somebody would make that into a book or into a.
Yeah, I mean, I think this. We get people emailing about optioning things quite often, but I think you're sort of joining the heaps of discourse that exist, and it's fair game. It's like the way you use somebody else's.
This question is to Rebecca. Did I understand when you refer to the push for virality as being one of your quests, professional quests, or you just act like an observer? And ultimately, let me tell you where I'm heading at. Isn't that doesn't that tell you a lot about why things are like they are? In other words, probably 99% have already caught that I'm not a native speaker, a native, but native anyway. That Americans are not known throughout the world for being particularly wise when understanding the world or even understanding themselves. There is Mexican writer Carlos Fuentes, who used to say that Americans excel at understanding themselves and not understanding the rest of the world. But looking at what really caught make it viral, makes me think that it's all about entertaining, diversion, rather than taking a joint. Why not doing this? Thank you.
I mean, I think that's a problem that is at the heart of like journalism, writing, like everything. Like, how do you make people interested in stuff that you like think they should be interested in versus what they're actually interested in, and how far you go towards trying to create interest. I mean, I try. That's all I can say. I mean, I'm a writer on the internet. Like, my stuff needs to be popular, or I don't get to keep doing it. Basically, like I mean, that sounds harsh.
Because I found Rebecca's presentation so fascinating. But I think that the questions underneath it are actually like not necessarily new to social sharing. Like every editor, all the time, the question is, why should I care about this? Like, what relevance will this have for my readers? How can we get people to care about this? Can we pull out a thread that is connected to a well-known figure? Can we emphasize something that seems like relatable and maybe contains that emotional element that now we've algorithmically almost determined is shareable? And so I think that tendency to certain coarseness is just sort of is part of that. But I think that there are ways to editors and writers are just making decisions, I think, all the time that are weighing like the sort of bet that this will be popular versus like this is a story that I think is the best story. And I think like they're always in conflict, and I think they will always be in conflict. But I think that a lot of, I don't know about Slate's expectations for your post, you know, but I think that, you know, as an editor, like, you actually don't know what's going to hit certain days, you know, like, you're just like throwing darts every day. So like, the best we can do is sort of try to answer the question, like, why do I care, and like, would I read this? And sometimes the answer is like, I'm going to read this because it's a fucking crazy picture, you know? Like, and then sometimes it's like, this is an incredibly nuanced, interesting take on something that I never knew about. So I guess like,
Oh yeah, no, I mean, I think I definitely agree that that's not new. I think what is new is the self-representation aspect of it, like to be like, I'm going to be the person who shares this, is different from, like, people might have read that Japanese mouse poster and like been interested in it, like, I don't know, you know, but it's not the same as being willing to put it next to your name. You see what I mean?
yeah, I think it's like there's a whole other discussion going on about metrics and measuring readership and sort of like, does somebody, like you can tell when someo's sharing something and they haven't read it. Like, should we stop really counting that as a thing we want to reward?
Yeah, I mean, in 2 years, sharing might not be what I think
Right,
about.
right.
You know.
Yeah, one of the just on this, one of the things that sort of came up in your presentation that really surprised me is that you're making decisions about sharing in the same way that you think your readers are making decisions about sharing, right? Like your ethical stakes and how it reflects on you, and that's that's sort of true about how we write as well. You know, like those gaps, like the outcome seems so severe on when you're talking about viralness and like stripping away, you know, the complexity. But those are actually the same decisions that we're making sort of every day, especially in the writing of history.
Totally, and I think in teaching too.
Yeah.
Hi, this is a question for Jake and Brianna. So you both mentioned the sort of question that you've come to about balancing writing for a popular audience and working on your dissertation, which is something that many of us in this room have to get done at some point. And one of the questions that we've all been kind of asking throughout the weekend with History in Action and how it's going to continue and whether it might continue is sort of this question of sustainability. And whether these initiatives that we're spearheading, whether it's on our own or in a team, have 2 feet to stand on to go forward. And I wonder if the two of you have thought at all about what you would like to see in terms of that sustainability model, and whether, you know, where this kind of pop history writing might fit into that for you, and how you'd like to, if you could have in a perfect world, have that proper balance, what would that look like for you?
Yeah, I've been trying to figure this out. I kept writing for Obscura. But the stories I've been doing are stories that I kind of had in my back pocket, you know. They're stories that are basically a reformatting of academic work I've done. The thought of taking on another project from scratch, like medieval America, is completely overwhelming. And I don't know that we would like ever get someone to like give us a grant. I don't know, ever give us a grant again. I don't know, but like it was a really good circumstance we had here, and it would be hard to reproduce that. And I think that's the big challenge too in thinking about, like, 'cause we also could see it in other formats. Or someone asked us the other day, like, have you thought about like if you could make this into a lesson, then like can someone teach this to make some kind of point? And we were like, yeah, we could do anything with it, but like, what? Yeah, what does that look like for us? How do we fit that in? So I found writing for a popular audience to be manageable as something I kind of like do when I'm done with my academic work, just because it's like, and particularly I'm reading for orals now, so I'm not writing anything. So like, it's a good way to like keep yourself writing and that kind of thing. I don't even leaving like after like everything's done. So that's not a perfect solution though. It's just the imagination. Do you have a better comment?
I guess I have sort of my perspective is colored by the fact that I'm extremely close to the history and action mission in Kool-Aid. And right, so I took on this project liking the idea that you don't have to choose an academic career that is only academic writing, right? Like it's the 21st century, it's the gig economy, so if your resume is expansive, the set of projects you can take on is expansive. It's probably horrifying.
No, I have a lot to say.
Okay. Which is all very nice in theory, but it was almost 2 months of full-time work. I mean, like, as my advisor here, like, I'm so far behind. And that's a real problem, like you say, for sustainability, and maybe you can actually speak more to this, Katie, about doing your own project, which is slightly similar. And there was one more, and yes, it was wonderful. There's an outcome there, but also like in terms of compensation, it was not, we're compensated for this, but it was not like that amount of money will not sustain me.
Like 7 months of hardcore, like really reporting work, like it would be like 1.01% per hour. Like really, we were,
But per word, it was reasonable. Well, whatever. Career pay is the important part. But again, and sort of that calculus is awkward and painful. And there's one more. Yeah, I guess the one there is.
I have a question, if I may. In our earlier session today on history and science, we heard a lot of discussion about the act of creating narratives around science, around sort of repackaging it and communicating it to lots of people who might not have a background in science and so on. And it struck me that even though you might consider the act of like translating science and then translating history for various audiences to be is different disciplines, but a vaguely similar sort of overall task. What, in your opinion, is the difference between us having so many writers who are known as science journalists? I mean, you can go from like Mary Roach all the way to Bill Bryson and like the code book, which takes cryptography and makes it really, really easy to understand. But perhaps Rebecca and Reyhan are two of the first people that I've ever really met or read your work, where I would actually describe you as history journalists. And I wondered what you had any thoughts about that.
Tons. I'm really jealous of science writers. They have a whole infrastructure, like there are jobs for them, and there are conferences, and they all seem to be friends with each other. I'm sure it's like a Erasmus career situation. But they seem to have there seems to be like a pre-understood sort of niche, and there is. I mean, since I think it's the early 80s that science communication became like a thing that there's programs in universities and there's like an infrastructure for it, and there really isn't for history writing, and I don't know why. I mean, I think probably why is that science communication has been supported by industry, like there's not someone to support history writing in the same way, but I also think that I don't know. I mean, I think a lot of times history writing, as it's done at publications like, for example, the New York Times, there's history writing in the Times, but it's all sort of like sideways, like it's in the culture section or maybe it's something about a museum that happens to talk about history or whatever it is, and it doesn't cover what's happening within academic history in a way. And that's sort of what I'm trying to do at Slate, is like, among other things, to cover academic history the way that science journalists cover science. To tell the historical stories that are emerging, but also to interweave within that the sort of the how history works stuff, like the sort of shadow historiography or shadow methodology in a way. And I think people are interested in it. And I think they're more interested in it than a lot of people think. But I think we have a long way to go. Like I've never, except for a job at Atlas, like I've never seen a job ad that mentions history as like a desirable specialty for a journalist. Like I basically like proposed my job as a thing, and through the vault sort of like made them like me. And so I don't know, like if I think about other sort of younger people or people who are emerging out of grad school who might want to do a similar thing, like I'm sort of like, it will definitely take a certain degree of entrepreneurialism. You don't have like a structure the way you have for science journalism.
I think that's true, although I think it's totally true, everything Rebecca said, but I also think that it's funny, at Atlas, we have a lot of conversation about how we're dissatisfied with how science journalism operates right now, and we are trying to think of ways to circumvent the, like, the study is published, it's embargoed, everyone drops their 500-word story at the exact same moment, or heavily access-driven stuff where, like, because of the deep relationships journals have with various labs or whatever, like, you know, a certain select people will always get the access, and, like, you know, our little team might get shut out. So I do think that there's, like, but I think that, like, there's like a lot of opportunity right now, I think, in history, and maybe science is crowded, but I think that you could flip it around and sort of say, like, there's a lot of wide open territory, and I do think that more and more places recognize, like, the powerful things that, like, a historical approach can bring to an audience that they're not getting other places. Like, and just like 2 days ago, Gawker was meeting with a scoop all over Twitter from them about pictures they found of Frank Koch, the Koch brothers' father's oil refinery in Nazi Germany. And I just thought it was kind of a funny, like, you know, it was pulled from Jane Mayer's book, but, like, you know, I've heard from them more that they are getting sort of inspired by the stuff they're seeing out there that takes a historical look.
But that's kind of the question, right? Like, that's being done by journalists. And the question is there, you know, can we actually add anything to this conversation that journalists aren't already doing? I mean, considering the constraints of morality and the constraints of storytelling that sometimes, not always, run antithetical to what it is that we do as professionals. So can we actually add anything to this? I mean, honestly.
Oh my God,
Yes.
totally. Oh my, like, science journalists aren't scientists, you know? Like, a lot of them are coming from a journalistic, conventional place.
But that's exactly the point.
That's the point.
They're not historians.
Yeah.
Right, but, like,
Right, but
I don't know.
But journalists who are writing about history, like, there are science journalists who have scientific training. Actually, I think that's like a plus in that field, to have like a BA or an MA or whatever it is, and sometimes even a PhD. But I mean, I think that, like, it depends on what you're talking about when you're talking about popular history writing. Like, there's bad popular history writing, and there's good. And, like, I don't think the good is always done by people who have graduate training, but I feel like often it is. Like, I don't know, I obviously have a dog in this fight, so, like, I shouldn't be delicate, but I definitely think that there's a way that people who have historical training are more sensitive to the nuance in a way that can, given the right editor, maybe, yield fruit.
Yeah, I take your point. But I think that one thing you're looking for is access to material that has not been covered a lot. And if you're a historian doing research in a particular field, you have such an advantage over a journalist who is, like, Googling for it. Like, you guys know where to look. Like, you kind of have the goods, and if you have that sort of information, I think you're going to find editors will want to work with you to maybe work out the kind of writing of it or adapting it to their particular audience.
I think that's an interesting contrast in the conversation about virality here with some of the things people were saying in the panel this morning about like the publisher, for instance, who said, you know, it doesn't matter, it's not how many people you reach, it's who you read it, who reads it. So when I'm talking about something in popular history and the kind of influence it has, is the link or the common thread that makes something pop history, is it just about commercial viability, or are there other things you're talking about there?
I think that would just depend on the publisher, like what their goals are, like where their funding comes from, like what, you know, I think in general, I think publications are looking for impact. And like, so you're gonna be satisfied with a story that maybe didn't reach like viral numbers, but seems to have made impact, has gotten picked up other places, is like making the publisher look good, basically, and look like they're publishing really interesting, worthy stuff that like people are paying attention to.
And different stuff.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I feel like maybe in my presentation I made virality seem too important in some way. Like in some way maybe it is, but I also was just trying to use it as a case study to say like, isn't it interesting why things are viral? Which isn't your question obviously, but maybe
I think maybe yes is part of the answer. Like it's about that only displaces the question. Like the question is why are these things commercially viable and other things aren't. Like
right.
that was sort of the part of your conversation.
Yeah.
There's
I don't know if that's
there,
your question.
there. Yeah.
So unfortunately, I only cut about half of the panel through the door. Well, I've already spoken to this. Just tell me on the next question. But could you speak a little bit about like the geographic distribution of the kinds of things that get posted on your sites? I mean, how much of it concentrates in the U.S.? I mean, do you see like a differential in terms of shareability or virality based on the sort of region or country that these posts create?
Well, so I think that there's an opportunity for more stories that come from outside of the U.S. or involve places or happenings that are not U.S. specific. I think that the U.S. is over-covered in other places, so I would do this as like we're very interested in stories that come from outside the U.S. Depending on what the story is, they can do extremely well. I don't think something being American is like a marker that we're like shit. Like this is from Asia, it's not gonna traffic. But I do think other places have overprivileged it, and again, like it's sort of it's an opportunity.
I don't think sorry, if I could ask a follow-up to that, actually. Do you know who's consuming your content?
Yeah, well, actually, the thing is, this is like another rant, but like, I think generally the insights you get from a lot of tools that measure traffic are like sort of nonsense, and I try to care about them only as much as my bosses care about them, because I think, sure, like I know what the profiles say in our various like reporting tools, like we skew male, more male than female. We, our readers are mostly from the U.S., but we have like significant pockets in like Australia, and Canada. But I don't. Every day as a daily publisher, you're just competing with every other thing that was published that day or has been published at any given moment on the internet. So I feel like the question of who your audience is as a digital only publication is it's not something I spend a lot of time thinking about, because I think that like we have to hit certain bars of just like what awesome, would the staff read it? Do we care about it? Do we like it? Are we framing it in the right way that we think will deliver it to the biggest audience? So kind of yes and no, I guess.
We have time for one more question. There is one more question. Yeah, Lindsay.
I wanted to ask a question to Rebecca, and you kind of touched upon this earlier, but last week on Slate you published this great pop story graphical essay, and I know you liked it because you treated it. And I was wondering what kind of traction something like that gets and how readers are engaging with that as opposed to things like Vault.
It can be upsetting sometimes. I have my own like weird psychological system for dealing with the pressure of like figuring out whether or not something does well, which is that I only look at the numbers on a story once a week, and that's tomorrow. So I haven't looked at it yet. Can you kind of tell like if you get a lot of new followers on Twitter that like people are reading it. I'm like, I got some new followers, so maybe it's okay. I don't know. But like there are definitely longer pieces that I write that are easily bested by a blog post. Like, I mean, all the other metrics that Reyhan was talking about in terms of distinctiveness and sort of representation of Slate as like the kind of place that would publish a 3,000 word piece on historiography of Native American slavery is like, that's important to them. So I don't get scared when I see that, but it is like one of those like ironies of life when you realize that something that you wrote in 2 hours is like easily beating something that you wrote in 40 hours, like, which that happens to me. Yeah. And I think that happens to everyone.
I worked at BuzzFeed, and so my 2 stories had more than 1 billion hits, and I don't even remember writing them.
And on that dire note.